Have you ever felt that tension, caught between your faith and a world that seems to demand a purely rational reason for absolutely everything? Well, you are definitely not alone. Today, we're going to dig right into that exact feeling, exploring how some of the most brilliant Christian thinkers of the 20th century wrestled with this very issue of faith and reason. Okay, let's get into it.
So this is the big question, the one that was really at the heart of the matter for these philosophers. It's a challenge that comes straight out of the Enlightenment. How do we think and how do we minister as Christians when the culture around us often just dismisses faith as, well, unreasonable? That's a tough place to be, isn't it? The dominant idea in the academic world was that Christian philosophy was basically a contradiction in terms. The thinking was, if you bring your faith to the table, you're somehow contaminating the pure process of reason. But is that really true?
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to trace how Christian philosophers answered that challenge. First, we'll lay out the modern challenge itself. Then we'll explore three really fascinating responses. First, going back to the incredible mind of Thomas Aquinas. Second, a pretty fiery debate about whether a Christian philosophy can even exist. And third, a totally different approach that sees faith and philosophy as partners in a conversation. And then we'll wrap it all up by bringing it right here to you and see what this all means for ministry today in our context here in Nigeria. I want you to picture a world where pure, unaided human reason is the king on the throne. And in this kingdom, faith is maybe like the court jester, kind of entertaining, but you don't take it seriously when it's time to make important decisions. That's pretty much the world that the Enlightenment helped build. It essentially said that real philosophy has to be neutral, objective, kind of like a science experiment, completely scrubbed clean of any religious beliefs. And as you can imagine, this put Christian thinkers in a really tight spot. It was like they constantly had to justify why they should even get a seat at the table of serious ideas.
So, how did Christian thinkers respond? How did they push back against this? Well, the first big move wasn't to invent something new, but to look back to the wisdom of the past to find the resources for the present. See, back in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII basically sounded an alarm. He called for a major revival of the work of Thomas Aquinas as a way to push back against this tide of modernism. And this wasn't just a mild suggestion, it was a powerful call to action that really lit a fire under a whole movement in the 20th century.
Now, this revival is known as Thomism. And let me tell you, this was so much more than just pulling some old books off the shelf and dusting them off. No, this was a dynamic, living movement. The goal was to take the deep, profound wisdom of Aquinas and bring it right into a head-on collision with modern thought. The big idea wasn't to run away and hide in the 13th century. It was to unleash the power of Aquinas' vision, this incredible integration of faith and reason to tackle the big questions of the 20th century. It was all about showing that this golden wisdom of Thomas was more relevant than ever before.
And here's where it gets really fun, because Thomism wasn't just one single thing, it had all these different flavors. For instance, you had a guy like Jacques Maritain, who pushed for a living Thomism that could actively engage with and transform modern culture, not just repeat old formulas. Then you had the incredibly bold Karl Rahner, who created something called Transcendental Thomism. I mean, this guy basically put Aquinas in the ring with modern heavyweights like Immanuel Kant and Martin Heidegger, just to show that Thomas could still go toe-to-toe with them. And finally, you get a more recent philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre, who, after showing how modern ethics had kind of fallen apart, looked around and realized that Thomism offered the most solid foundation for reason and virtue. Three very different thinkers, all drawing from the same deep well.
This quote, wow. This is from Pope John Paul II's 1998 letter, Fides et Ratio, and it just perfectly sums up the whole Thomistic vision. Just think about that image. Faith and reason aren't enemies. They're not fighting each other. They're like two wings on the same bird. You need both of them working together in harmony to soar, to rise up, and actually get to the truth. It's such a beautiful and powerful image, and it's a complete rejection of that modern idea that you have to choose one over the other.
Okay, so the revival of Thomism was a huge success. But you know how it goes. Success often brings new questions, and this one was a biggie. It forced Christian thinkers to ask themselves a really fundamental question. What is Christian philosophy, anyway? Is it a real, legitimate academic discipline, or is it just theology wearing a philosopher's costume? This question would spark a massive debate that, honestly, is still going on today.
And man, did this debate get heated. The main event was this famous clash in France in the 1930s. In one corner, you had the skeptic, Émile Bregier. He just threw down the gauntlet and flat out said there was no Christian philosophy. For him, it was just a rehash of Greek philosophy with a little bit of Christian religion sprinkled on top. But in the other corner, you had the brilliant Thomist historian Etienne Gilson. He fired back, arguing that, no, Christian revelation was like this secret ingredient, this indispensable auxiliary,
that actually pushed reason to ask brand new questions and took philosophy to places it could never have gone on its own. And don't think this was just some argument happening in France. Oh no, this debate jumped right across the Atlantic and set up shop in American philosophy too. On one side, you have the absolute powerhouse Alvin Plantinga. He's a central figure in what we call Reformed epistemology, and his whole point was that believing in God is a perfectly reasonable place to start thinking from. He told Christian philosophers to stop apologizing for their faith and to go on the offensive, to challenge the hidden anti-religious assumptions in the university. But then, on the other side, you had guys like D.Z. Phillips, who argued that a philosopher's job is just to do philosophy, plain and simple. For him, your personal beliefs don't matter, you're just doing philosophy, period.
Okay, so we've seen the move to reclaim a tradition and the move to defend the very idea of Christian philosophy. But what if there's a third way? What if faith isn't a system you have to prove or a fortress you have to defend, but what if it's more like a dance partner for reason? This is the third and final approach we're going to look at today, and it's a path that totally changed the conversation.
The key idea here is a complete shift in perspective. Instead of seeing philosophy and faith as opponents in a boxing ring, this approach sees them as two friends having a deep, challenging, and really productive conversation. You know, one of those conversations where you both walk away having learned something new. It's less about winning an argument and a whole lot more about gaining understanding.
Two of the most important voices in this new conversational approach were Hans-Georg Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur. Gadamer talked about reading a text, like the Bible, as a fusion of horizons. What he meant is that our world and the world of the text come together, and in that meeting, we're changed. It's not about us mastering the text, it's about entering into a genuine dialogue with it. Ricoeur had a slightly different take. He said that faith and philosophy should stay as separate fields, but that the powerful symbols of our faith, think about the cross, the resurrection, these things can act like a spark, giving rise to incredible philosophical thought. They kickstart the whole process.
Okay, so we've been swimming in some pretty deep philosophical waters. I get it. But here's the most important question. What in the world does any of this have to do with you? As a future pastor, a future ministry leader, right here in Nigeria? How can these abstract ideas actually help you in the real world? Let's bring this all the way down to earth and see how these models can be powerful tools for you. I want you to think of these three responses we've discussed as three essential tools in your ministry toolbox. First, you've got the Reclaiming Tradition tool, inspired by people like Aquinas. This is the tool you use to build a deep, solid, biblically grounded worldview for the people you lead. This is the heart of discipleship. Then you've got the Defending the Project tool, following in the footsteps of thinkers like Plantinga. This is your apologetics tool. This is how you confidently and clearly answer the tough questions and critiques that our faith faces every day. And finally, you have the Fostering Dialogue tool, inspired by Gadamer and Ricoeur. This is your bridge-building tool. It's about learning to listen to our culture, to find common ground, and to show intellectual hospitality. All three are vital.
So as we wrap this up, the final question isn't about which of these models is the one right answer. That's not the point. The real question is for you to reflect on which model, or maybe which combination of models, is God calling you to use in your specific context. Are you called to be a reclaimer of tradition, a defender of the faith, or a fosterer of dialogue? The truth is, the complex challenges of the 21st century right here in Nigeria are going to require all three. The only question left is, what kind of thinker, what kind of leader will you be?